The train had been 3 days out of St. Louis. Evelyn Cross had spent most of those 72 hours wedged into a window seat in the second-to-last passenger car, her trunk stowed in the rack above her head, her hands folded in her lap with a practiced stillness that had nothing to do with calm. She was 29 years old, which she'd been told more than once was on the late side of hopeful for a woman looking to start over. She didn't argue the point. She simply kept folding her hands and watching the land change outside the glass. The gentle green of Missouri giving way to rolling brown, then to a flatter, harder country that looked like it had been ironed down by something heavy and left to dry. She had a letter in her coat pocket. She'd read it so many times the fold lines had gone soft, and the ink on certain words had blurred slightly from handling. She didn't need to take it out to recall what it said. She knew it by heart, the way you know a song you never meant to memorize. I am a man who has known sorrow, Miss Cross, and I believe you have known it too. I do not write to you with fancy words or empty promises. I write because I am in need of a steadfast woman, and from your letters I believe you may be exactly that. Blackridge is not a gentle place, but I have land, and I have a son, and I have more than enough room for someone who is willing to work and willing to stay. Grant Mercer, rancher, widower, father of one boy, age 9. She'd found his advertisement in the back pages of a Kansas City Gazette that a woman from her boarding house had left in the common room. She almost didn't answer it. She'd been burned before. Not like this, nothing like this, but burned enough to be careful. She'd spent 2 weeks drafting her first reply, crossing out sentences, starting over, trying to sound sensible without sounding desperate, interested without sounding starved for it. He'd written back within 10 days. They exchanged letters for 4 months. He was a decent writer, nothing showy, but clear. He talked about the ranch, about the weather patterns in that part of the territory, about how his son Noah had taken to collecting arrowheads along the creek bed. He asked about her life in practical terms. Could she cook? Did she know anything about livestock? Was she afraid of hard winters? She answered everything honestly. She told him she could cook and sew and keep accounts. She told him she was not easily frightened. She told him her mother had died 2 years prior and that she had no family left to speak of, which was part of why the idea of building something new didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like the only sensible thing left to do. He'd sent her the train fare in his 6th letter. She'd returned half of it, not out of pride, but because it didn't feel right to arrive having cost a man money before he'd even decided whether he wanted her there. She used her own savings to cover the difference. She told herself that was the rational thing to do. She did not tell herself the truth, which was that she was so afraid of being turned away that she wanted to owe him as little as possible before she got there. The train pulled into Blackridge on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and the station platform was thick with people. Freight unloading, travelers stretching their legs, a few horses tied at the far end, a woman with 3 small children trying to keep all of them pointed in the same direction. It was loud and smelled of coal smoke and manure, and the sky above the town was the pale, washed-out blue of a place that didn't get much rain. Evelyn stepped down from the car with her trunk being handed down behind her by a bored-looking porter, and she stood in the middle of it all and looked for Grant Mercer. She was looking for a man of about 40, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, medium build. He'd described himself with the same blunt precision he used for everything else. She scanned the platform once, then again, then a third time more slowly, checking each face. She was not immediately alarmed. Trains ran late, men ran late. She set her trunk down at her feet and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The crowd thinned as people moved off toward the town, or toward horses, or toward waiting wagons. The porter who'd helped with her trunk had long since disappeared back inside. A station master in a striped vest emerged from the ticket office, noticed her standing there, and gave her the kind of look that people give to things that shouldn't still be there. "You waiting on somebody?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "A Mr. Grant Mercer. He's a rancher. He has land outside of town, I believe." The station master scratched the side of his jaw. "Grant Mercer." "Yes." He shook his head slowly. "Don't know that name, ma'am, and I know most of the ranching outfits in this county." Something went cold in her stomach. "He may be newer to the area," she said, "or perhaps he operates under a different name for the property." "Could be." But his tone said he didn't think so. She waited another 30 minutes. The station master went back inside. A dog wandered the far end of the platform and eventually lost interest in her and wandered back off. The sun moved, the shadows on the wooden board shifted, and Evelyn Cross stood very still and let the truth settle over her the way cold water settles, not all at once, but steadily, until you're soaked through and there's no pretending otherwise. He wasn't coming. He had never been coming. She went to the sheriff's office because she didn't know where else to go. Sheriff Dale Pruitt was a compact, weathered man with a graying mustache and the measured demeanor of someone who had heard most things at least twice. He listened to her without interrupting, which she appreciated, and when she finished, he leaned back in his chair and pressed his lips together in a way that told her he had heard this before. "You got the letters?" he asked. "Yes." She'd brought them. All of them, bundled with a piece of ribbon, because she'd been planning to show them to Grant Mercer's son, thinking a child might like to see that his future mother had written thoughtfully and at length. She set them on the desk. Pruitt picked up the top letter, read the first few lines, set it back down. "Return address? A post office box in Leavenworth. I wrote back to that box each time." "And you sent money." She kept her face level. "He sent me train fare. I sent back half. I used my own savings for the other half." "Any other money?" "He mentioned—" She stopped. She hadn't thought about it in those terms. "He mentioned that Noah needed winter boots and that the ranch supply account was short. He said he was embarrassed to ask, but that he'd replace it once I arrived and he could draw against the property account." She paused. "I sent $22. Pruitt nodded slowly. Not surprised. Not sorry exactly, but not indifferent either. "Ma'am," he said, "I've had 3 complaints in the past 18 months from women who came through here looking for a man named something different each time, but described the same way. Good letter writer. Always a widower. Always a child." He folded his hands on the desk. "You're not the first. I want you to know that. You're not stupid or naive. You're the 4th. She held herself very carefully still. "Did you find him?" "No, he moves. Uses different post boxes, different names, different towns." He paused. "The money's gone, if that's what you're wondering. There's no recovery on that. I can take your statement and add it to what we have, and if we ever pin him down, you'll be contacted. But I'm not going to tell you to expect much." "I see. Is there family you can wire? Someone who can send for you?" "No." He looked at her steadily. "Do you have money enough to get yourself somewhere?" She'd been doing the math in her head since the platform. Train fare home, except home wasn't anywhere anymore. She'd given up her room in St. Louis, and her seamstress work had been filled. $43 wouldn't get her far. Not far enough. "I'll manage," she said, which was not the same as yes. She took a room at the Callaway boarding house because it was the cheapest one she could find, $2 a week, which included breakfast and use of the washroom twice a week. The woman who ran it, a broad-shouldered widow named Mrs. Callaway, had the manner of someone who had seen hard luck often enough to have stopped finding it remarkable. She handed Evelyn a key and told her supper was at 6, and that she didn't allow men past the front parlor. Evelyn thanked her and carried her trunk upstairs. The room was small. There was a bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the alley between the boarding house and the building next door. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall for a while. She was not a woman who cried easily, which was sometimes a mercy and sometimes simply meant the grief sat in her chest longer before it found somewhere to go. She thought about the letters, all those carefully chosen words, all that deliberate honesty on her part, answered by, what? Performance. A man sitting somewhere with good handwriting and a patient temperament, crafting a believable person out of nothing. It was such a particular kind of cruelty, she thought. Not violent, not loud, just methodical. He had studied what lonely women needed and then delivered it, sentence by sentence, until they handed him everything. She had handed him $22 and half a year of hope. She was not going to waste time hating herself for it. That was something she was firm about, sitting on that thin mattress in the alley-side room. You could hate yourself later. Right now, she needed to figure out what she was going to do. The next morning, she was up before most of the house, dressed and downstairs before Mrs. Callaway had finished the breakfast bread. She asked if there was a notice board in town where work might be posted. "Hardware store has one," Mrs. Callaway said. "So does the feed and grain. You got a particular kind of work in mind? Housekeeping, cooking. I can keep accounts if needed. I'm capable with the sewing machine. Mrs. Calloway gave her a look that wasn't unkind. You might ask around. Some of the ranch families need help, especially heading into winter. It's hard work, though. I'm not afraid of hard work. She spent the morning walking the 2 main streets of Black Ridge, reading posted notices, asking at the dry goods and the hardware store. She got a few leads, a banker's wife looking for a kitchen girl, a seamstress who needed a finisher. But the banker's wife wanted someone who could commit to 2 years, and the seamstress couldn't pay enough to cover a room. By noon, she'd talked to 6 people and had nothing solid. She was standing outside the Feed and Grain reading a notice board when she heard a man's voice behind her. You're not from here. She turned. The man was somewhere in his mid-30s, or maybe a hard-lived 30. It was difficult to tell. Tall, lean in the way of someone who worked physical labor consistently rather than from want. Dark hair, in need of a cut. A jaw that looked like it hadn't seen a razor in 4 days. He was holding a sack of something over one shoulder and looking at her with direct, frank eyes that weren't unfriendly but weren't particularly warm either. No, she said. I'm not. Looking for work? Reading the board, yes. He set the sack down and glanced at the board himself. There's not much on there worth taking. Hannigan's banker wife treats kitchen help like their furniture, and the Duval woman at the seamstress shop hasn't paid anyone on time in 3 months. Evelyn looked at him. You seem to know a lot about the local employment situation. I live here. He shifted the sack. Wade Bennett. I run a cattle operation about 4 miles east. It's not a large outfit. Evelyn Cross. They shook hands. His was calloused and dry, and he didn't hold it longer than was necessary. I'm in need of a housekeeper, he said. Through winter, at least. My boy's getting on, and the house it's gotten behind. He said the last part in a tone that suggested he was skipping something, and she didn't ask what. Rooms included, meals included, and I pay $7 a week. It's not glamorous. She didn't ask why he was making the offer to a stranger on a street corner instead of through the notice board. She suspected she already knew the answer. He'd tried the notice board and it hadn't worked. People in towns had opinions about widowers hiring live-in help. She was an outsider, which made her socially safer. I'd need to see the arrangement, she said, the room and the house both, before I commit to anything. He nodded. Reasonable. I can bring you out tomorrow morning if you're available. I'm available. Wade Bennett's ranch, the following morning, was 4 miles east of town along a rutted wagon track that cut through scrub and dry grass and crossed 2 shallow creek beds. He'd come to collect her in a flatbed wagon, alone, which she'd noted. No foreman, no hand-along for propriety. She sat on the bench beside him with her trunk in the back and watched the land open up, and he drove without talking much, which she found she didn't mind. The house, when it came into view, was not what she'd steeled herself for, but close. It was a solid structure, 2 stories, good timber, the kind of place that had been built with intention and then sort of abandoned to momentum afterward. The fence along the front needed mending in at least 2 places. The kitchen garden was bare and overgrown in the way of something that had been left to go its own way. A rusted piece of equipment she couldn't identify sat on the side of the house and appeared to have been sitting there long enough that the grass had grown up around it. The windows were clean, though. She noticed that. It needs work, he said. He wasn't apologizing, just stating. Yes, she said. I can see that. He brought the wagon around to the side and tied the horse, and as they walked toward the back door, a boy appeared from the barn. He was small for whatever age he was, with dark hair like his father's, and eyes that were doing several things at once. Curious, cautious, trying very hard to look like neither. This is Noah, Wade said. He's 9. Hello, Noah, Evelyn said. Hello. He looked at her carefully. Are you going to stay? I'm looking at the house first, she said. He seemed to find this sensible. It's messy in the kitchen. Noah, his father said. It is, though. It was. The kitchen was not dirty, exactly. She could tell someone had made intermittent efforts, but it had the particular disorder of a space being managed by people who didn't really know how to manage it. Dishes stacked unevenly, a pot on the stove with something dried to the bottom. flour that had been spilled on the work table and sort of pushed aside rather than wiped. The pantry held enough supplies for the season, but they'd been put away without much system. The rest of the house was similar. The front room had dust on the upper surfaces, but the floor had been swept. The stairwell had clean steps, but the banister was loose. The room she'd be given, a modest space off the main bedroom with its own door to the hall, had a good bed and adequate furniture and a window that faced south. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. "My wife passed 14 months ago," Wade said from behind her, in the flat tone of a man who had learned to say the sentence without inflection. "She handled most of the house. I've been managing." "I can see that you've been trying," she said, which was true and seemed kinder than several other things she might have said. "I'm not looking for sympathy," he said. "I'm looking for someone competent who'll do the work and not make the situation stranger than it already is." She turned to look at him. He met her eyes without flinching, which she respected. $7 a week, she said. "Through winter. At the end of winter, we reassess." "That's what I said. I want it agreed that you'll treat me as staff, not as anything else. Clear expectations, clear terms, no ambiguity about what the arrangement is." Something moved across his face. Not offense, more like something loosening slightly. "Agreed. And if Noah is struggling," she said, "I want to be permitted to address it directly, not managed around, not kept at arm's length from whatever he's carrying." This gave him pause. "He's fine. He's 9 and he lost his mother a year ago," she said. "He's probably not fine." Wade was quiet for a moment. He looked at the floor, then back at her. "You can use your judgment," he said finally. "I'm not asking you to fix him, but you can. Use your judgment. That's all I ask." She went downstairs and told Noah she'd be staying through winter, and he looked up from the book he'd been pretending to read and said, "Okay," in a voice that was working very hard to sound like it didn't matter. Bossem. The first week was not smooth. That was the honest word for it. Not smooth. She had expected a learning curve, and she got one. Not from the work itself, which was straightforward enough, but from the texture of being in a house full of grief that nobody was talking about. Wade worked from before dawn until well after dark most days. He appeared at meals, ate without much comment, answered questions when she asked them, and was gone again. He was not rude. He was not warm. He existed in the house the way a Waite exists. Present, substantial, not particularly interested in being examined. Noah was more complicated. The boy was bright. She could see that immediately. He read everything he could get his hands on, asked questions that were slightly too precise for his age, and had the habit of watching people from oblique angles rather than directly, as if he'd learned that direct attention sometimes made things disappear. He was also stubborn, in the low-grade way of children who have learned that the adults in their lives have a limited supply of patience for their needs, and who have adjusted accordingly. He did not warm to her immediately. She did not expect him to. "What was her name?" she asked one afternoon about a week in. She was restacking the pantry, and he was sitting at the kitchen table doing schoolwork. "Whose name?" "Your mother's." He was quiet for a moment. "Margaret, but Pa called her Maggie." Another pause. "Everybody else called her Margaret." "What did you call her?" "Mama?" He looked down at his paper. "I'm supposed to be doing arithmetic." "Go ahead," she said, and went back to the pantry. Later, she found him at the back of the barn with a small tin box that he quickly tucked behind a feed sack when he heard her coming. "I'm not prying," she said, stopping at the barn door. "I was looking for the extra lantern." "It's on the hook to the right," he said. "Thank you." She took it off the hook. "The tin box is none of my business." He was quiet. "My mother died 2 years ago," she said. "I kept her silver brooch in a box for a while. It helped to have a place for things." She paused. "I had to sell it eventually, but it helped while I had it." She left the barn. 10 minutes later, she heard him come back into the house. He didn't say anything, but the next morning, he came down for breakfast 5 minutes early and set the table without being asked. She had been at the ranch for 11 days when she went into town for supplies and heard her name said by someone she didn't recognize. She was at the dry goods counter, working through a list, when 2 women near the yard goods bolts began a conversation that they'd lowered by about half a degree, which in Evelyn's experience usually meant they hadn't lowered it enough. "That's the woman, the one who came in on the train and got left standing." "The Bennett housekeeper?" Hmm, poor thing. You heard how it happened? She answered one of those matrimonial advertisements, and the man took her money, and Evelyn kept her eyes on her list. Wonder if Wade knows what he's brought into his house. A woman like that, obviously desperate, living under a widower's roof. She didn't look up. She kept her voice level when the counter clerk returned, and she worked through the rest of the list and paid what she owed. She carried her purchases out to the wagon, loaded them, and sat on the bench for a moment with her hands in her lap before she picked up the reins. The humiliation was a familiar shape, at least. She knew what it felt like. She'd been the object of town sympathy and town speculation before, when her father lost his business, and when her mother got sick, and when she'd been quietly let go from a teaching position because the school board felt a woman without family connections was an unstable presence. She knew how to carry it without letting it spill. What she hadn't been prepared for was that it would find her here. She'd thought she was far enough from St. Louis that the story hadn't traveled. She'd thought Black Ridge was big enough that no one cared. She drove back to the ranch and unloaded the supplies and started on dinner. And when Wade came in at noon and looked at her face, and he did look, she noticed, briefly, he didn't ask. After dinner, when Noah had gone out to see to the chickens, he said, "Town talk got to you." It wasn't a question. "Small towns talk," she said. She was washing the pot. "Yes. I'd rather people say things I can hear than things I can't, so I'm not bothered." "That sounds like something you say when you're bothered." She stopped washing the pot for a moment. Then she started again. "I'll manage." "I know you will," he said. "That's not what I meant." He picked up his hat. "I meant, I've heard it too. Some of what they're saying about you being reckless, desperate, the rest of it." He turned the hat in his hands. "I don't believe it, for whatever that's worth." She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her, he was looking at the hat. "It's worth something," she said. He nodded once, put the hat on, and went back out. By the end of the first month, the house had changed enough that even Wade noticed, though he didn't say so until Noah pointed it out at dinner. "It smells different," Noah said. "Noah," his father said. "It does, though. It smells like something's actually cooking and not just being warmed up." Evelyn kept her expression neutral. "Your father was doing his best." "Pa's best at cattle," Noah said sagely. "He burned the biscuits twice." "That was before," Wade said. "The biscuits were like rocks, Pa." "They were fine." "They weren't." Noah turned to Evelyn. "They were actually rocks. I gave one to the dog, and the dog looked at it and walked away." She laughed, which surprised her. It surprised Wade, too, she could tell. His face shifted slightly, something loosening around the eyes. He didn't laugh, but it wasn't far off. Noah looked pleased with himself. That was the first evening she thought, maybe this is somewhere she could actually be. Not forever, not with any certainty, but for longer than winter. Maybe. She found the first letter 2 days later. She wasn't looking for it. She was cleaning out the top shelf of the kitchen hutch, moving things to make room for the extra preserves she'd put up, and it fell out from behind a cracked crock. An envelope, addressed to Wade Bennett, with a Leavenworth postmark. She would have put it back without looking, except the handwriting on the envelope stopped her. She'd seen that handwriting before. Not those words, not that name, but the particular angle of the capitals, the way the letters tilted just slightly forward, the tail on the G. She stood very still on the step stool, holding the envelope, with a feeling running through her that she could not immediately name. She set the envelope on the table. She went back to what she was doing. She told herself she was imagining things. Handwriting was not fingerprints. Plenty of people had similar hands. But she thought about it all evening. And the next morning, while Wade was out early and Noah was still asleep, she went to her room and got out her letters. She set one on the table beside the envelope on the hutch shelf, not opening it, just the outside of each. And she looked at the handwriting side by side. It wasn't the same. She exhaled. It wasn't the same hand. The angle was similar, but the specific letter forms were different, the S particularly, and the capitals. She'd been seeing something that wasn't there. She put her letters away. She left Wade's envelope on the edge of the hutch where it had fallen. She went and made breakfast. But something nagged at her anyway, like a sound you hear from outside in the middle of the night and can't identify. She had not imagined the similarity. And the postmark, Leavenworth, where the postbox had been. She told herself it was nothing. The mind found patterns. The mind especially found patterns when it had been badly frightened and was still flinching at shadows. She made biscuits. They rose correctly. Noah ate 3 of them and declared them actual food, and Wade drank 2 cups of coffee and said almost nothing, which she had learned was his version of contentment. She told herself it was nothing, but she kept the date of that postmark in the back of her mind, the way you keep a candle close when you're not sure how long the dark is going to last. 3 weeks later, on a cold Thursday afternoon, Mrs. Pruitt, the sheriff's wife, who had introduced herself at the dry goods counter and had the friendly, watchful manner of someone who served as the town's informal memory, stopped Evelyn in the street and said, with the careful casualness of someone delivering important information in a casual container, "You hear a man came through Holt County last month? Used a postbox in Leavenworth, they say. 3 women. One of them lost everything." Evelyn stood very still. "Did they catch him?" "No." Mrs. Pruitt looked at her steadily. "He moved on. That's what he does, they say. He stays ahead of it." "I see." "Dale says if the territory put together all the complaints from different counties, it'd be enough to hang him." She paused. "But complaints from different counties have a way of staying in different counties." "Unless someone put them together," Evelyn said. Mrs. Pruitt nodded slowly. "Unless someone did that, yes." They looked at each other for a moment with the understanding of 2 people who both know what's being said without either of them having said it. "Thank you," Evelyn said. "You take care of yourself," Mrs. Pruitt said, and moved on. Evelyn walked back to the wagon. She sat for a moment. The wind off the flats was cold and tasted like dust, and the sky to the west had gone the particular orange-gray of weather coming in. She thought about the letters in her coat pocket. She thought about Mrs. Pruitt's face. She thought about a man who moved and stayed ahead of it, who had studied what women needed and delivered it in careful sentences, who had probably already found his next postbox and his next name and his next invented child named something other than Noah. She thought about the woman in Holt County who had lost everything. She picked up the reins. The wind was picking up out of the northwest, and there was real cold in it now, the kind that meant business. She had a long drive back and dinner to start when she got there, and Noah had mentioned that morning that one of the school primers he needed had a loose binding that was about to give out entirely. She had things to do, people waiting on her. But that postmark, Leavenworth, sat in her mind like a stone at the bottom of a clear creek, visible no matter how she tried to look past it. Sooner or later, she was going to have to reach in and pick it up. She just didn't know yet what she'd find written on the other side. The cold settled into Blackridge the way it always did out on the flats. Not gradually, not with any warning worth preparing for, but all at once, like a door swung open onto empty winter. By the first week of November, the creek beds had a crust of ice along their edges each morning, and the cattle moved closer to the windbreak fence, and Wade came in from the early rounds with his hands red and his jaw set in a way that had nothing to do with mood and everything to do with temperature. Evelyn had been at the ranch 6 weeks. She was not comfortable yet. Comfort felt like the wrong word for what she and this household had arrived at. It was more like an arrangement that both sides had stopped fighting, the way a river and its bank eventually stop arguing about where the edge is. She knew where things were. She knew how Wade took his coffee and how Noah liked his eggs and which floorboard outside the boys' room creaked loudest at night. She knew that Wade went quiet in a particular way on the 14th of each month, which she'd eventually calculated was the day his wife had died. She knew that Noah kept a small photograph tucked inside the back cover of his arithmetic book and never took it out when he thought anyone might see. She knew these things, and she held them carefully, the way you hold borrowed things that aren't yours but have been trusted to you anyway. The Leavenworth postmark had not left her mind. She had not spoken of it to Wade. She wasn't sure what she'd say. She'd gone back to the hutch shelf when she had the kitchen to herself and looked at the envelope again. And then felt foolish for looking, because of course there was a reasonable explanation. The territory was full of correspondence from Leavenworth. It was a major hub. People sent things from there all the time. She was pattern matching out of fear, and she knew it, and she still couldn't quite stop. Mrs. Pruitt had confirmed what she already suspected. The man was still out there, still moving, still ahead of it. She kept working. She didn't know what else to do. The house, at least, was responding to her. That was the right word. Responding, like something that had been waiting for the right set of hands. She'd rehung the kitchen door that had been scraping the floor. She'd patched the gap under the back window where the draft came through and turned the corner of the kitchen 3 degrees colder than the rest. She'd organized the pantry by season and use, mended the curtains in the front room, gotten the loose banister post reset with a combination of wood glue and a technique she'd learned from watching her father, who'd been a practical man before his luck ran out. She'd found a rhythm with Noah. It had taken time, and it hadn't been a straight line. There were days he was closed off in the way of a child who has learned that attachment is a risk, and other days he was so hungry for someone to talk to that he'd follow her from room to room, narrating his thoughts about arrowhead composition and the migratory habits of birds, and whether or not the stars were the same stars ancient people had seen, or if they'd moved around and were different ones now. He was, she'd decided, a remarkable child buried under about 14 layers of careful self-protection, and she wasn't trying to strip those layers away. That would have been wrong, and she knew it, but she was trying to make it slightly less necessary for him to have so many of them up all the time. The arithmetic book came up one evening when she was at the table working through the household accounts, and he was sitting across from her, supposedly finishing his schoolwork. "You have a photograph in the back of that book," she said, not looking up from the ledger. He went very still. "I know. I'm not going to say anything about it." "I know," he said again, slightly differently. She turned a page in the ledger, wrote a figure. "My mother had a particular way of braiding her hair. I couldn't even tell you exactly what it was now, which bothers me. I remember the shape of it, but not the specifics." He was quiet for a moment. "Mama smelled like the rose water she kept on her washstand," he said. "I can still remember that. When I can't remember her face right, I remember that instead." "That's a good thing to hold on to," she said. "Pa got rid of the rose water," he said. It wasn't accusatory. "Just a fact," said flatly. The way children say things they've been carrying for a long time and haven't found a place to set down. She didn't say anything immediately. She wrote another figure. "He probably couldn't stand to have it there," she said finally. Noah thought about this. "I didn't think about that. Grief is strange," she said. "It makes people do things that look wrong from the outside but make sense from where they're standing." "Are you sad?" he asked. "About your situation?" She looked up at him. He was watching her with that oblique, sideways attention she'd noticed from the beginning, the kind that saw more than it appeared to. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "but less than I was." He nodded as if this were useful data. Then he went back to his arithmetic. That evening, when Wade came in for dinner, she noticed that Noah watched his father differently, slightly more carefully, with something that might have been a shift toward understanding or at least a shift toward trying. Whether it would hold, she didn't know. Children's insights had a way of going underground before they surfaced properly. But it was something. Wade noticed it too. He caught her eye across the table, briefly, and she looked away first. She had established a rule for herself early on that she was not going to read anything into the way Wade looked at her. He was a man managing grief and a ranch and a child, and she was his housekeeper, and the situation was what it was, and that was all it was. She was firm about this. She needed to be. This was harder on certain evenings than others. He wasn't easy to read. That was the true thing. He didn't talk much, and when he did, he was precise rather than expansive. He said what needed saying and not much more, which could feel like coldness until you spend enough time around him to understand that it wasn't. He watched. He remembered things she mentioned and occasionally referenced them later in ways that suggested he'd actually thought about what she'd said, which she found unsettling in a way she couldn't properly articulate. One evening, she came in from the clothesline with the last of the laundry and found him in the kitchen, which was unusual at that hour. He was standing at the stove, attempting to do something with the leftover beans from dinner, and the attempt was going poorly. "Move," she said. "I'm managing. You're about to burn the bottom again." She set down the laundry basket and came to the stove. He stepped aside without arguing, which was the closest thing to graceful she'd seen from him in a domestic context. She took the spoon, stirred from the bottom, turned down the flame. "You have to watch the heat with beans." "I've been cooking beans for 4 years, and burning them for at least 1, based on the state of that pot when I arrived." She said it without heat. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was something adjacent. "Evelyn." She looked at him. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, looking at the floor, which was his version of gathering himself before saying something he'd been thinking about for a while. "Those women in town," he said. "What they've been saying. I've told you I can manage that." "I know, that's not—" He stopped. Tried again. "A couple of the men from neighboring operations said something to me last week about my judgment, about having you here." He looked up. "I want you to know that I told them to mind their own concerns, and I meant it." She kept her eyes on the pot. "I appreciate that." "I'm not looking for appreciation." He said it bluntly, but not unkindly. "I'm saying it because I want to be clear that what they're saying doesn't change anything on this end. You've done good work here, more than I expected, and I expected a fair amount." He paused. "Noah's better. He's more like himself than he's been in over a year." Her throat tightened. She didn't let it show. "He's a good boy," she said. "He was always going to come back to himself. He just needed some consistency. He needed someone who wasn't drowning," Wade said quietly. She looked at him then, and the plainness of what he'd just said, the absence of self-pity in it, just a clean acknowledgement of fact, hit her somewhere she hadn't been expecting. "You weren't drowning," she said. "You were treading water. There's a difference." He considered this. "Not much of one. Enough of one," she said. "You kept the ranch? You kept Noah in school? You kept the lights on?" She turned back to the beans. "That's not a man who's drowning. That's a man who's exhausted." The silence after that was different from the usual silences. She couldn't have explained the difference exactly, only that it had a different weight to it. "Get a bowl," she said. "Beans are done." He got a bowl. The week after that conversation, she found a mended section of fence along the kitchen garden that she hadn't asked anyone to fix, and the rusted piece of equipment from the side of the house had been removed. And the cellar door that had been awkward to open for as long as she'd been there had apparently had its hinges looked at and was now perfectly functional. She didn't say anything about it, neither did he. But she noticed, and she suspected he knew she'd noticed, and that was a kind of conversation too. It was December when the first solid piece of information came through. Sheriff Pruitt wrote out himself, which told her before he opened his mouth that it was something he'd decided she needed to hear directly, rather than through his wife's careful telegraphing. She saw him from the kitchen window, coming up the wagon track, and she had the coffee on by the time he knocked. Wade came in from the yard while Pruitt was still at the kitchen table, and Evelyn didn't ask him to leave because she'd realized by then that whatever the sheriff was going to say, it was going to affect the household anyway, and there was no point in the pretense of privacy. Pruitt wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at the table for a moment. "We've been in contact with the Territorial Marshal's office," he said, "about the case. Your case, and the others." He glanced at Evelyn. "There's now a name attached, or at least a name he's used most recently, a man calling himself Raymond Coulter. Before that he was Thomas Haig, and before that he went by a third name I can't recall offhand." Evelyn was very still. "Raymond Coulter. He's been operating in a pattern across 4 counties over the past 2 years. Always the same method, the matrimonial advertisements, the letters, the manufactured intimacy." Pruitt's mouth tightened slightly on that last phrase. "He's confident. He's careful. And he moves fast when he thinks he's about to be caught up to." "Where is he now?" Wade asked. He was standing near the door with his arms crossed, and his voice was the particular flat quiet it got when he was paying close attention. "That's the thing," Pruitt said. He looked at his coffee. "Best information we have, he may be heading back this direction." The kitchen was very quiet. "Why here?" Evelyn said. "Because you're here." Pruitt set the cup down. "The marshal's office thinks he may have gotten word that you're still in Blackridge, that you didn't leave. His previous victims, they ran, mostly. Went home, if they had home to go to. Went somewhere else if they didn't. He counts on that. On the shame being enough to make women disappear." She understood immediately what he wasn't quite saying. "He's coming back because he thinks I might be a problem." "He's coming back because he wants to make sure you're not," Pruitt said. "I don't know his exact plan. I only know the marshal thinks he's moving in this direction." Wade spoke. "What does she need to do?" "Stay alert," Pruitt said. "Don't go into town alone if you can help it for a while. And," he looked at Evelyn, "if anyone contacts you, letters, visitors asking after you, tell me immediately." "I understand. After Pruitt left, the kitchen felt smaller. Evelyn stood at the window for a moment, with her back to Wade, looking out at the gray December yard. "You should go to another town," Wade said, "just until this is settled." "No." "Evelyn, I said no." She turned around. "I am not running. I ran from St. Louis because I had nothing to run toward. I'm not running from here." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "This isn't about pride." "No," she said. "It's about the fact that if I leave, he wins again, and he will find another woman to do this to. And another." She held his eyes. "I'm the one who stayed. That makes me the one who has the best chance of being useful to stopping him." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." "All right?" I said, "All right." He pushed off from the doorframe. "You stay, but you don't go into town without me or one of the hands with you. And if anything comes through the mail that looks off, you bring it to me first." "I'm not your responsibility." "You live in my house," he said. "That makes you my responsibility whether it fits your preferences or not." He picked up his hat. "You want to argue about it later? I'll be in the north pasture." She watched him go. The thing was, she did not want to argue about it. She wanted, with a force that caught her slightly off guard, to accept it. Not the authority of it, but the fact of someone meaning it. Someone standing between her and a thing she couldn't see yet. She stood in the kitchen a while longer. Then she went back to work, because there was always work to go back to, and because keeping her hands busy was the best way she knew to keep her head clear. 2 days later, a letter arrived. It was addressed to her at the Black Ridge post office. She'd left a forwarding notice with Mrs. Calloway in case anyone needed to reach her. And the handwriting on the outside sent a cold spike of recognition straight through her before she'd even opened it. She sat in the wagon on the main street of Black Ridge with the envelope in her hands for 3 full minutes before she opened it. The letter was short, 2 paragraphs. It was signed with a name she didn't recognize, but the voice in it, the careful warmth, the particular way it constructed sentences to sound intimate without being specific, the way it angled toward making her feel seen, was one she knew from 4 months of correspondence. The man calling himself Raymond Coulter, or whatever he was calling himself now, had written to express his sincere concern for her welfare. He'd heard, he said, that she'd been deceived by a man in Black Ridge. He wanted her to know that there were still honest people in the world. He wanted her to know he was one of them. He asked, very gently, if she might be willing to correspond. She sat in the wagon with the letter in her lap and thought about the woman in Holt County who had lost everything. She thought about the other women before her, the ones who had run. She thought about Mrs. Pruitt saying he stayed ahead of it, and Pruitt saying he counts on the shame making women disappear. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her coat pocket. She drove to the sheriff's office, went inside, and put the letter on Dale Pruitt's desk. "He wrote to me," she said. Pruitt read it twice. The muscle in his jaw moved. "He's brazen," he said, mostly to himself. Then, "You didn't write back." "No." "Good. Don't." He looked up at her. "This goes to the marshal's office today. This is the first direct contact we have. This is evidence." "I know," she said. "That's why I brought it." She drove back to the ranch. The cold was harder now, the sky pressing down flat and white, and the road was rutted and frozen, so the wagon shuddered along with a sound like someone banging a drum badly. She was cold all the way through, and her hands inside her gloves had gone stiff. When she pulled into the yard, Noah came running from the barn. "Pa said you went to town," he said, slightly out of breath. "Was it all right?" He was worried. "I'm fine," she said. "Help me with the horse." He took the bridle as she climbed down, which he'd been learning to do properly for the past few weeks. He was getting the hang of it, she could tell. The horse didn't shift away from him the way it had at first. "He didn't say he was worried," Noah said, leading the horse toward the barn. "But he kept coming to the window." She looked at the house. The front window was empty. "Your pa has a lot of things on his mind," she said. "He has you on his mind," Noah said, with the matter-of-fact candor that 9-year-olds deploy without understanding the weight of it. She followed him into the barn, helped him settle the horse, and didn't say anything to that, because she didn't trust what she might say. That evening, after Noah was in bed, she told Wade about the letter. She told him exactly what it said and what she'd done with it, and he sat across from her at the kitchen table and listened without interrupting. When she was done, he looked at the table for a moment. He knows where you are, he said. Yes. He's testing whether you'll respond. Yes. And if you don't respond, he said, what does he do next? She'd been thinking about this since the moment she'd read the letter. He escalates, she said. Men like that. When the quiet approach fails, they don't retreat. They push harder because they can't afford to leave a witness behind them who won't stay quiet. Wade was quiet for a moment. How do you know that? Because it's what Pruitt described without quite describing it. She met his eyes. And because I know the letter, I know how he writes. There was something under the warmth of it that wasn't warm at all, something that wanted to see if I'd flinch. Will you? No, she said, but I want you to understand what that might mean. I'm not going to pretend this is only my problem anymore. It's on your doorstep too, and Noah's. She paused. If you want me to go, I'll understand it. He looked at her as if she'd said something strange. I told you 2 days ago, he said. You live here. You stay. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without decoration, as if the decision had been made and the discussion of it was only a formality. What I want to know is what the next step looks like. The marshal's office has the letter now, she said. Pruitt is going to push for a warrant, or at least an alert to bring the man in for questioning if he shows in the county. The letter establishes contact and intent. She paused. But he's careful. He may not show himself directly. Then we wait. Then we wait, she agreed. She didn't sleep well that night. Not from fear exactly, but from the particular agitation of knowing something is moving toward you and not being able to see its shape yet. She lay in the dark of the south-facing room and listened to the winter wind against the eaves and thought about the letter, the voice of it, the careful false warmth that she'd once mistaken for something real. She had been so ready to believe in it. That was the thing she sat with, in the dark. Not the anger at being deceived. The anger was there, clean and useful. But the harder thing underneath it, the understanding of how much she had needed what he'd offered, and how that need had made her briefly unable to see clearly. She was clear now. Whatever was coming, she was clear. Down the hall, Noah's room was quiet. Downstairs, the fire had been banked low, and the house ticked and settled around her in the way of old timber structures that have absorbed enough seasons to have their own opinion about the cold. She thought about what Noah had said in the barn, without thinking about the fact that he was saying it. He kept coming to the window. She pressed her eyes closed and told herself firmly that this was not something she could afford to think about right now, and then spent another 20 minutes thinking about it anyway before she finally, mercifully, fell asleep. He came on a Wednesday. Evelyn knew it was him before she saw his face, the same way you sometimes know a storm is coming before the sky has done anything visible to announce it. Something in the quality of the air, something that sits wrong. She was at the dry goods counter in town with Wade's hand list and a wool coat she'd borrowed from the peg by the door because her own was still damp from the morning, and the bell above the shop door rang and she looked up. And there he was. He was not what she'd imagined. She had built a picture of him over months, something blunt and coarse, a fraud who looked like a fraud, something you could spot if you were paying attention. This man was none of those things. He was perhaps 45 with a pleasant, open face and the kind of steady brown eyes that suggested patience and honesty. He was well dressed without being showy about it. He had a hat in his hands rather than on his head, which was the small social gesture of a man who had learned that small social gestures paid dividends. He was looking directly at her, and he smiled, not surprised, not caught. He smiled the way a man smiles when something he planned has gone exactly as expected. "Miss Cross," he said, "I thought that might be you." The shop was not empty. Mrs. Duval was behind the counter. 2 women were looking at yard goods near the back. The counter clerk, a boy of about 16 named Pete, was frozen in the act of writing down Evelyn's order and watching this exchange with the focused attention of someone who understood he was witnessing something, but not yet what. Evelyn's heart was going fast. She made herself hold still, made herself hold his eyes, because she understood with complete clarity in that moment that whatever happened in the next 5 minutes would set the terms of everything that followed. "I don't know you," she said. The smile didn't waver. "Now, Evelyn," and the use of her first name was deliberate. She heard it, like a claim being staked. "I think we both know that's not entirely true. We've corresponded." "You wrote me 1 letter under a name I didn't recognize," she said. "That's not correspondence. That's an approach." Something moved behind his eyes, brief and not pleasant, but his face stayed warm. He looked around the shop with the comfortable ease of a man who was accustomed to rooms being on his side. "I can see you're cautious," he said. "That's understandable given what you've been through. I came here precisely to clear the air, to explain myself." He moved toward the counter, unhurried, and set one hand on the edge of it. "I know my letter must have seemed strange, coming from a stranger, but I've been making inquiries on behalf of a group of concerned citizens who've been tracking the man who deceived you, and I have information." "What name did you use when you wrote me?" she said. He stopped. "Pardon?" "The letter. What name did you sign it?" A brief pause. "Sinclair," he said. "Richard Sinclair. And before that?" He tilted his head slightly. "I'm not sure I follow." "Raymond Coulter," she said. "Thomas Haig." She said both names flat and clear and watched his face. The shop had gone very quiet. Mrs. Duval had stopped pretending to arrange things behind the counter. "Those are two of the names the Territorial Marshal's office has on file." The warmth in his face cooled by about 5 degrees. It wasn't gone. He was too skilled for that, but it shifted, took on a different quality, the way light shifts when a cloud moves across the sun. He glanced around the shop, registered the audience, and made a visible decision. "I think," he said, "you may be confused. And I understand why, after what you've experienced." "I'm not confused." She set down the list she'd been holding. "You wrote letters to women who were lonely enough to answer matrimonial advertisements. You built something that felt like trust and felt like genuine interest, and then you took their money. You did it to me, and you did it to at least 3 other women in this territory that I know of, and there are likely more." She paused. "And now you're here because I didn't leave. Because your system depends on women leaving, and I didn't." He looked at her for a long moment. Around them, the shop was absolutely silent. Then he laughed. It was an easy, sorrowful laugh. Practiced, she recognized, the laugh of a man who has learned that a well-timed laugh can make a woman sound hysterical by contrast. "I came here out of genuine concern," he said, loudly enough now for the room, playing to the audience she'd inadvertently assembled. "I had heard about a woman who'd been cheated, who'd been living in a difficult situation, and I wanted to offer my assistance. If she's chosen to be suspicious of my motives, I can only say that the man who deceived her has done real damage to her ability to trust, and to her, get out of this shop." The voice came from the doorway. Wade had not been in the shop when she arrived. He'd been at the hardware store half a block down, and he must have come to find her and heard something through the open door, or been told by someone passing. She didn't know, and it didn't matter. He was in the doorway now, not in the dramatic posture of a man spoiling for a fight, but in the utterly still way of a man who has already made up his mind and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up. The man who called himself Sinclair looked at Wade. Then he looked back at Evelyn. The calculation in his eyes was brief and naked. "I believe this is a public establishment," he said pleasantly. "Mrs. Duval," Wade said without looking away from the man, "is there anything stopping you from asking a customer to leave?" Mrs. Duval, to her considerable credit, said, "Not a thing, Mr. Bennett." The man smiled again, but it was a different smile than before. Thinner. "I'll go," he said. "I have no interest in causing a scene, Das." He looked at Evelyn. "But I'll say this, Miss Cross. The story you're telling about me is a serious one. Making accusations against a man's character in a room full of witnesses is the kind of thing that has consequences." The warmth was entirely gone now. What was underneath it was not rage. It was colder than that, and more considered. You should think carefully about what you say in public, and to whom. "Are you threatening her?" Wade said. "I'm offering friendly advice." He put his hat back on. "Good afternoon." He left. The bell above the door rang again, and the shop stayed quiet for another 3 or 4 seconds, and then Mrs. Duval exhaled loudly and said, "Well," and that broke it. Evelyn's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the counter and kept her eyes forward until the shaking stopped, which took longer than she would have liked. Wade came to stand beside her. He didn't touch her, which she appreciated, because if he had touched her with any gentleness at all, she thought she might have come apart at the seams in front of Pete the counter clerk, which was not something she intended to let happen. "You all right?" he said quietly. I'm fine. You're not. I will be. She picked up her list. Give me a minute. He gave her a minute. She finished the order, her hands steadied. When they walked out of the shop 10 minutes later, she told him everything the man had said, every word, as precisely as she could reconstruct it, because precision was important now, and she knew it. Wade listened without interrupting. They were walking to the wagon, and the main street of Blackridge moved around them with its ordinary Thursday business. A man rolling a barrel across the road, 2 horses tied at the saloon rail, a woman shaking a rug from an upper window. And Evelyn recited what had happened and tried to hold on to the details before they blurred. He threatened you, Wade said, when she'd finished. He called it friendly advice. That's what people call threats when they want to be able to deny them later. He helped her up to the wagon bench, which he usually didn't do, and she let him because her legs felt less reliable than usual. Pruitt needs to know today. I know. Today, Evelyn, not tomorrow. I said I know, she said, with a sharpness she immediately regretted. I'm sorry. I know. He climbed up beside her and picked up the reins. He didn't say anything about the sharpness. The women in the shop heard everything, she said after a moment. Mrs. Duval, too. Yes. I hadn't planned that. I wasn't planning to confront him publicly. He just walked in and She stopped. You held your ground, Wade said. Don't apologize for it. She looked at him. He was looking at the road. I named the other names, she said. The marshals' names. In front of witnesses. Good. He flicked the reins. If he shows up in this county and tries to claim you're slandering him, he's going to have to explain why he answers to 3 different ones. She sat with this for a moment. The wagon moved through town and out onto the eastern road, and the cold pressed in around them, and she thought about the man's face when she'd said the names, that brief, unguarded moment when his calculation had shone through the warmth like bone through skin. He's going to come at it differently now, she said. Yes. He said making accusations against a man's character has consequences. That wasn't a general observation. No, Wade agreed. It wasn't. They drove the rest of the way in silence that was not uncomfortable but was full of thought. Hers, and she suspected his. When they got back to the ranch, Noah came out of the barn and looked at their faces and said, with the acuity of a child who has learned to read adult weather patterns, What happened? Nothing that concerns you yet, Evelyn said. Did you finish your schoolwork? Almost. Go finish it. He went. But he looked back once from the barn door, and the look on his face was the particular look of a child who understands that something is coming and has already started bracing for it. She went to Pruitt that same afternoon. She sat across from him and told him every detail she could remember, and he wrote things down and didn't interrupt, and when she finished he leaned back and said, He's accelerating. What does that mean? It means he feels exposed. Contacting you directly, coming to where you are showing his face, that's a departure from pattern. He usually operates at distance. Pruitt looked at his notes. Either he thinks he can still neutralize you somehow, or he's planning to discredit you before you can do more damage. Maybe both. How would he discredit me? Pruitt was quiet for a moment. A man in his position has a few options. He claims prior acquaintance, says you have a relationship that you're misrepresenting, or he gets ahead of the story with his own version of events, paints you as unstable, vindictive. He paused. A woman who came here under false pretenses, living in a widower's home. There are already people in this town who've made assumptions about your character. He knows that. He'll use it. The words sat in the air between them like something solid. So my reputation is the weapon, she said. He thinks it is. Then I have to be ahead of him on that too. She went to see Mrs. Pruitt that evening. She'd gotten a feel for the woman over the past weeks. Her particular combination of genuine warmth and iron practicality, the way she held information without spreading it, the way she understood the social architecture of a small town in the way that some people understand weather. She was the right person. She sat at the Pruitt's kitchen table and told her everything, without the editing she'd done for Pruitt. She told her about the letters and the $22 and standing on the platform. She told her about the shop that afternoon and what the man had said, and what she thought he was planning to do next. Mrs. Pruitt listened with both hands around a coffee cup and her eyes steady. What do you need? She said when Evelyn finished. I need people to know my account before he tells them his, Evelyn said. Not gossip. The facts plainly said. I've been humiliated enough that I think I should be the one to say them, rather than letting them circulate secondhand and get altered. Mrs. Pruitt nodded slowly. There are women in this town who will listen, she said, and women who will not. And women who will pretend to listen and then do whatever their husbands already thought. She paused. But there are enough of the first kind, if you're willing to tell your story to a group. I'm willing, Evelyn said. It wasn't comfortable to say, but she said it. 2 days later, a small gathering assembled in Mrs. Pruitt's front parlor. 7 women, which was not many, but was more than nothing. The wives of 2 neighboring ranchers, a school teacher, a woman named Iris Galloway, who ran the town's only laundry and had the manner of someone who had managed difficult situations for most of her adult life, and 2 women Evelyn hadn't expected, visitors who had arrived on Thursday's train and who she recognized with a jolt as Mrs. Clara Hesse and Mrs. Anna Dell, names she knew from Pruitt's files. They were 2 of the other women, 2 of the ones who had received letters from the same careful hand. Mrs. Pruitt had contacted them. When, or exactly how, she didn't know, but she felt something loosen in her chest at the sight of them. Not relief exactly, but something that was its near neighbor. Clara Hesse was a small, sharp-faced woman from a town 50 miles east who had lost $60 in 3 months of her life to a man calling himself William Marsh. Anna Dell was from Holt County, younger than Evelyn had expected, with dark circles under her eyes and the particular wariness of someone still deciding whether it was safe to be in a room. Evelyn told her story again. She told it enough times now that she could do it without the flinching, without the pauses where the shame tried to break in. She told it factually, and she told it straight. And when she finished, Clara Hesse told her own story, and then Anna Dell told hers in a voice that was quiet, but didn't break. And by the time the 3 accounts were laid out side by side in that front parlor, the pattern was unmistakable, even to women who'd never had reason to think about such things. He's going to come at her character, Mrs. Pruitt said to the room. When he does, I want every woman in this room to know what she actually is and what he actually is. Iris Galloway, who had said nothing until this point, spoke up. What's the sheriff able to do right now? He has a letter that establishes contact, Evelyn said. The marshal's office is involved, but it takes time, and he may move before the warrant comes through. Then we don't let him move quietly, Iris said. He wants to use gossip as a weapon. Fine. We make sure the gossip is ours first. It was not a subtle strategy, and Evelyn was not entirely comfortable with it, but she was also not so proud that she'd refuse good practical help on the grounds of elegance. I'm not asking anyone to put themselves in a difficult position, she said. Honey, Clara Hesse said, not unkindly, we're already in a difficult position. Every woman in this room who's heard this story is now in a position. That's how this works. She folded her hands in her lap. The question is whether we're in it together or separate. She went home that evening and found Wade at the kitchen table with the account books she kept, which surprised her. He rarely looked at the household accounts, having made it clear early on that he considered that her domain. The books are fine, she said. I've been keeping them balanced. I know. He closed the cover. I was thinking about something else. He looked up. I went by Pruitt's office today. He told me about the warrant, about the timing. It may not come through before he acts. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The confrontation in town. What you did in the shop, naming him in front of witnesses. He won't leave that alone. No, she agreed. She sat down across from him. He's going to try to say I've misidentified him, or that we have a prior relationship he can characterize differently, something that reframes everything I've said as the behavior of a woman scorned or unstable. Wade's jaw tightened. He's going to lie. He's good at it. What happens if people believe him? She looked at the table. It was a real question, and she gave it a real answer. Then I'm a woman living in a widower's house with a ruined reputation in a town that's already halfway convinced I have poor judgment, which makes me considerably easier to dismiss when I try to press charges. He was quiet. I'm not saying that to frighten you, she said. I'm saying it because it's the real shape of the thing, and I don't see a use in looking away from it. What do you need? He said. It was the same question Mrs. Pruitt had asked, and she found that it still caught her off guard to be asked it plainly. I need you to tell anyone who asks that you found me to be a trustworthy and capable person, she said. That's all. Your word carries weight in this county. If someone comes to you with a story that contradicts that, I'll tell them they're wrong, he said. It may not be comfortable. A lot of things aren't comfortable. He pushed the account book back toward her side of the table. Did you eat dinner? She blinked. No, not yet. I made the beans. A pause. I watched the heat. She almost laughed. How are they? Not rocks, he said. Probably. She got up and found bowls. The thing about the days that followed was that they were ordinary on the surface and anything but underneath. She cooked and cleaned and helped Noah with his schoolwork and kept the house running, and all of it was real and necessary, and she was grateful for it because having something to do with her hands was the only thing that kept the waiting from becoming unbearable. She was waiting for him to move. She could feel it, the way you feel a tooth that's going to go before it does. That low, constant awareness of something that hasn't happened yet but will. He moved on a Friday, 10 days after the shop. The story came to her in pieces. Mrs. Pruitt first tight-voiced at the boarding house where Evelyn had stopped to collect a piece of mail. Then Iris Galloway at the laundry, who filled in the parts Mrs. Pruitt had not said. Then, hardest, from Wade when she got back to the ranch. He'd heard it at the feed store, he told her, from two different men who said it like they were passing along weather information. The man had been to a lawyer in a neighboring county. He had signed a document, a declaration, or an affidavit, or something that used legal vocabulary to create the appearance of official weight, claiming that Evelyn Cross was his common-law wife, that she had been with him for 2 years in Leavenworth, that she had taken money from him under false pretenses, and then fled with it, and was now living under an assumed identity in Blackridge, having fabricated the story of deception to deflect attention from her own crimes. She sat very still while Wade told her this. He filed it with a lawyer, she said. Hartfield in Denison, who apparently didn't ask too many questions. Does Pruitt know? I told him this morning, before I told you. He paused. Pruitt says it's not a criminal charge. It's a civil claim. Harassment dressed up in paper is what he called it, but it's on record, which is what Coulter wants. She understood. A document, even a false one, filed in a lawyer's office 30 miles away, was a solid thing. People believed solid things. And a woman without family or formal standing in a town, living in someone else's house on someone else's charity, however unfair the characterization, was not in the best position to contest a solid thing. He's patient, she said, meaning he'd planned this. The visit to the shop hadn't been impulsive after all. It had been the opening move. Yes, Wade said. He is. What happens now? He sat down across from her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, or hadn't let herself see. Not distress exactly, but the look of a man who has decided something and is working out how to say it without it coming out wrong. I went to see Hartwell, he said. Hartwell was Blackridge's sole attorney, an older man with a tendency to wheeze when he was thinking. Before I came home, this afternoon. She stared. You went to a lawyer? I did. About what? He looked at the table for a moment. About the fact that if Coulter is claiming you're his wife, and that claim is on paper, then the most direct answer to that paper, legally speaking, is a counterclaim. She was quiet. She was not sure she was following him correctly. Hartwell said, he continued, looking at her now, steady and direct and slightly uncomfortable in the way of a man who has done something that felt necessary and is not certain how it will be received. That a woman who is provably the wife of another man cannot simultaneously be the wife of a third party. Even under the most liberal reading of territorial law, the claim dissolves. The kitchen was very quiet. Wade, she said carefully, what are you saying? I'm saying Hartwell has paperwork, he said, and that it's your choice. And I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm not asking you to decide anything at all. I'm only saying that if you wanted to, if it seemed like the right answer to the problem, there's a practical path. He stopped, pressed his lips together, tried again. And I'm saying that it wouldn't be only practical for me. I want to say that clearly. So you don't think this is Wade? He stopped. Are you asking me to marry you? She said. To solve a legal problem? He looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. And this man who said things plainly and without decoration and almost never seemed at a loss said, "I'm asking you to marry me. The legal problem is what made me say it out loud sooner than I might have otherwise." She looked at him for a long time. He held her eyes and did not look away. And the kitchen was warm and smelled of the beans he'd made, and outside the winter wind moved along the eaves of the house he'd built and let fall behind and was slowly pulling back toward something that resembled hope. "I'm not going to decide tonight," she said. "I said you didn't have to, but I'm not. I want you to know." She stopped, which almost never happened to her. "I want you to know it wouldn't be only practical for me either," she said, "if I decided." He exhaled. It was a very small sound, but she heard it. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. She didn't sleep well that night either, but for an entirely different reason than the nights before. And when she lay in the dark this time, listening to the wind, there was something under the fear and the uncertainty that she was very careful not to look at too directly. The way you're careful with a coal that's just starting to catch. Because if you look at it wrong, it goes out. And if you don't look at all, it might catch enough to last the night. She lay there and held it carefully and didn't try to name it. Down the hall, Noah slept without knowing any of it. And downstairs, she suspected Wade was sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee, not sleeping either, holding something in the same careful way. The man calling himself Coulter and Sinclair and half a dozen other names was still out there. The warrant had not yet come. The document in Hartfield's lawyer's office was still on record, still doing its quiet, deliberate damage. But in Mrs. Pruitt's parlor, 7 women knew the truth of it. And Clara Hess and Anna Dell had not gone home after telling their stories. They were staying at the boarding house, which they hadn't mentioned but which Mrs. Pruitt had, with the particular tone of someone laying cards on a table. And tomorrow, Evelyn was going back to Pruitt's office with the name of the lawyer in Denison and the name Hartfield and every piece of paper she had, and they were going to make a response that was as formal and as public as the attack had been. She was not running. She closed her eyes. Whatever was coming, she was ready for it in the way that people are ready who have already lost everything once and found they were still standing. Not unafraid, not untouched, but standing. She pressed her face into the pillow and eventually slept. She answered Wade's question on a Sunday morning. Not dramatically, not with any ceremony or preparation. She came downstairs to find him already at the table with his coffee, the way he always was before dawn, and she poured herself a cup and sat down across from him and said, "Yes, if the offer still stands." He looked at her. "It stands." "Then yes." He nodded once. She nodded once. They drank their coffee. Outside, the winter was doing something complicated with the light. A pale streak of orange along the flat eastern horizon. The rest of the sky still the deep blue gray of very early morning. Noah was still asleep upstairs. The house was warm from the banked fire, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and neither of them said anything else for a while, which was exactly right. It was not a romantic morning, particularly. She had bags under her eyes from poor sleep. He had hay in his hair from the early feeding. When he reached across the table and put his hand over hers briefly, it was not a practice gesture. His hand was rough and warm, and it stayed for about 4 seconds before he withdrew it, and they both looked at the table. But it was real, which was something she had come to value considerably more than polish. "We should tell Noah," she said. "After breakfast," he said. Noah took the news with the contained, careful expression of a child receiving information he has been wanting for a long time and is afraid to react to too visibly in case it turns out not to be real. "You're staying," he said. Not to his father, to her. "Yes," she said. "If that's all right with you." He looked at the table, looked at his father, looked back at her. Then he said with studied casualness, "I thought you'd probably stay eventually," and went back to his breakfast, and the tips of his ears were red. Wade caught her eye across the table. She looked away first. She was smiling, and she didn't want him to see how wide it was. The following week was not a honeymoon in any sense. There was too much pressing business for that, too many things converging at once, and she was not a woman who had the luxury of stepping back from a crisis simply because her personal situation had shifted. Hartwell drew up the paperwork. She and Wade went to his office on a Tuesday afternoon, both of them slightly stiff with the awkwardness of the situation. Both of them dressed more carefully than they usually would have been for a Tuesday, which neither of them mentioned. The ceremony itself was brief and carried out without spectacle. Hartwell read the necessary words, two of his clerks served as witnesses, and it was done. She was Evelyn Bennett. It sat strangely for a day or two, not badly, only strangely. The way new boots feel on the first wearing, substantial and foreign both at once. She kept her name in her mind and turned it over. She had not expected to marry this way, in a lawyer's office with practical urgency behind it, rather than any particular romance. But then she had not expected most of what the past several months had brought, and she had long since made peace with the fact that her life was not going to follow the shape she'd originally drawn for it. What mattered was the truth of it, and the truth of it was that when Hartwell said the words and Wade said, "I will," in his flat, direct way, she'd felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for longer than she cared to count. The marriage certificate went immediately to Pruitt, who forwarded it to the territorial marshal's office along with a formal rebuttal of the affidavit Coulter had filed in Denison. The lawyer in Denison, Hartfield, received a letter from Hartwell outlining the fraudulent nature of his client's claim. Within 4 days, Hartfield had quietly withdrawn from the case, and the affidavit had been struck from his records. Pruitt told her this with a satisfaction he did not quite manage to conceal. "He's losing his footing," he said. "The marshal's office is moving faster now. The letter you gave me, the shop confrontation, they have enough for a formal warrant. They're issuing it by end of week." "Will they find him?" Pruitt was quiet for a moment. "He's been found before and slipped, but this time there are 4 counties coordinating, and he made a mistake." "Which one?" "Coming here, showing his face." He looked at her steadily. "He's used to operating through paper and distance. The moment he walked into that shop and threatened you in front of witnesses, he gave up the one advantage he's always had." "That he's invisible," she said. "That he's invisible," Pruitt agreed. She thought about the man's face in the shop, the way the warmth had dropped from it when she'd said the names. Not panic, not remorse. The colder thing, the calculating reassessment. She'd seen it for only a moment, but she'd seen it clearly, and she thought Pruitt was right. He had made a mistake. He was a man who trusted his own performance too completely, who believed in his own skill at reading people to the point where he'd misjudged what kind of woman he was dealing with. He'd read her as someone who would be paralyzed by shame. He'd been wrong. The week the warrant was issued, Clara Hesse and Anna Dell were still in Blackridge. They had been there for 3 weeks now, which was longer than anyone had planned, but neither woman had returned home, and Evelyn had stopped being surprised by this. Clara was staying at the boarding house and had taken up helping Mrs. Calloway with the kitchen work in exchange for reduced rent, which Mrs. Calloway had accepted with the pragmatism that characterized everything about her. Anna Dell was quieter, still tightly wound, but she came to Mrs. Pruitt's parlor in the evenings, and she was talking more than she had in the first week. Evelyn went to see them the day after the warrant was issued. She found them together at the boarding house kitchen table, Clara with her sleeves rolled up and a pile of mending in front of her, Anna nursing a cup of something warm and looking out the window. The kitchen smelled like bread and lye soap, which was a smell Evelyn associated with boarding houses and working women and the particular domestic competence of women who had been managing difficult circumstances for most of their lives. "The warrant's come through," she said. Clara set down the mending. Anna turned from the window. "They have to find him first," Anna said. She said it without pessimism, just as fact. The voice of someone who had been hopeful before and was being careful with hope now. "Yes," Evelyn said, "but they have 4 counties looking, and he's made himself visible here in a way he usually doesn't." "He was always going to make a mistake eventually," Clara said. "Men like that, they get comfortable. They start believing they're smarter than everyone else combined." "He is smart," Anna said quietly. "That's the thing that's hardest to admit. He's genuinely smart." "Smart and careful aren't the same thing," Evelyn said. "He was careful until I didn't leave, and then he got sloppy." Anna looked at her. There was something in her face, not admiration exactly, but a kind of recognition. "You stayed on purpose," she said. "You knew if you stayed it would bring him out." "I didn't know," Evelyn said honestly. "I hoped. It was more like I couldn't stand the idea that leaving was the only option. that he'd built a system where the only response available to us was to disappear. Clara said, "Well," she picked up the mending again. "You didn't disappear, and now there's a warrant." She bit off a thread. "That's more than any of us had before." They did not arrest him that week. He wasn't found in the county, wasn't found in Denison, wasn't at any of the boarding houses or hotels in the surrounding territory where Pruitt and the marshal's deputies had made inquiries. He had, as was his pattern, moved, but for the first time he had moved with the weight of a formal warrant behind him, rather than simply outrunning the slow communication between disconnected counties. The waiting was its own kind of difficult. Evelyn went about her days with the knowledge sitting on her shoulder, not crushing her, but there, constant. She cooked and kept the house, and worked through the household accounts, and helped Noah with the increasingly complex mathematics his schoolteacher had started sending home. She and Wade had a quiet, unspectacular married life that was nothing like what she'd imagined marriage would feel like when she'd been younger, and was better than what she'd imagined in ways that were hard to explain because they were mostly small. He fixed the fence post along the kitchen garden without being asked. She noticed he had a habit of sitting with his coffee longer on days when something was weighing on him, and she'd learned not to ask about it until the second cup. He was better with Noah than he gave himself credit for. Not demonstrative, not easy, but steady in the way that children need someone to be steady. And Noah knew it even when the two of them were working through one of their intermittent standoffs over something like schoolwork or barn chores. One evening in late January, Wade came in from an unusually long day in the north pasture and sat down at the kitchen table and didn't move for a while. She was at the stove and she let him be. After about 10 minutes, he said, "One of the cows lost her calf. Couldn't get to her in time." "I'm sorry," she said. "It happens," he said. "Doesn't mean I have to like it." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." He rubbed his face with both hands. Noah found out. He was upset. "Where's he now?" "Barn." He wanted to be alone. She left the stove and went out to the barn. Noah was in the far corner on a hay bale, not crying, but with the particular set to his jaw that she recognized as the Bennett version of grief, pressing the feeling down, keeping the outside composed. She sat beside him without saying anything. After a while, he said, "It's not fair." "No," she said. "It isn't. Pa says it happens, and you can't prevent every loss." He's right. That doesn't make it feel better. Does it get better? He meant the question broadly. She could tell. He was not only talking about the calf. "Not smaller," she said carefully, "but you get bigger around it, if you let yourself." He thought about this. "That's a strange way to say it." "I know. It's the honest way, though." He leaned against her shoulder briefly. A fraction of a second, almost like he'd done it by accident and was deciding whether to acknowledge it. She didn't move. He didn't pull away. They sat in the barn for another 10 minutes without talking, and then went inside for supper. The news came on a Thursday in early February, just over 3 months after she'd arrived in Black Ridge on the train that should have delivered her to a man who didn't exist. Pruitt came out himself again. This was becoming a pattern, she thought. The sheriff in his wagon coming up the track, which was never casual, which always meant something substantial. This time his face was different, though. Not the careful deliberateness of someone delivering a complicated situation. Something lighter. "They have him," he said, before he was fully through the kitchen door. The room went absolutely still. "Where?" Evelyn said. "Cheyenne. He was using yet another name, James Colby this time, and had already made contact with 2 women through the matrimonial pages. The marshal's office had been watching the Cheyenne post office for 2 weeks. Pruitt sat down. He looked tired but satisfied, the look of a long project finally reaching its end. "He was arrested yesterday morning. He's being held in Cheyenne pending transfer." "Transfer where?" Wade asked. "Here, eventually. He'll face charges in this county first since we have the most documented evidence. The other counties will follow." Pruitt looked at Evelyn. He had letters on him when they arrested him. Letters he'd been drafting. 4 new women. She pressed her hands flat on the table. 4 new women. She thought about each of them. Women she'd never meet, who had almost stepped into the same trap. Who, because Coulter had made a mistake and she had stayed, would not. "What are the charges?" she asked. "Fraud, primarily. Obtaining money under false pretenses. Multiple counts across multiple jurisdictions." Forgery. The affidavit he filed against you adds an attempted fraud charge and potentially a defamation claim under territorial law. Pruitt paused. It's a substantial case, Evelyn. The marshal's office thinks it's strong. They'll need testimony, she said. Yes. From you, and ideally from Mrs. Hess and Mrs. Dell if they're willing. He looked at her steadily. The trial won't be easy. He'll have a lawyer, and that lawyer will do what lawyers do, which is try to make the witnesses seem unreliable. He's going to try to use your situation, the way you came here, the circumstances, to paint you as someone with a motive for making false accusations. I know, she said. I want you to be prepared for it to be ugly before it gets resolved. Sheriff Pruitt, she said, I have been prepared for things to be ugly since October. What I need to know is whether the evidence is strong enough that if I testify, it holds. He didn't hesitate. It's strong enough. Then I'll testify. She told Clara and Anna that same evening. She drove to the boarding house herself, Wade with her, and sat at Mrs. Calloway's kitchen table and told them the man had been found and there would be a trial and she was going to stand up in front of a court and say what he had done, and she needed to know if they would do the same. Clara Hesse said yes before the sentence was fully finished. Anna Dell was quiet for a moment. She looked at the table. She looked at Evelyn. There was something moving behind her eyes. Not reluctance exactly, but the internal accounting of a woman measuring her courage against what she knew the cost would be. Will people believe us? She said finally. Some won't, Evelyn said, and we have to go in knowing that. But the evidence isn't only us. There are letters, there's the false affidavit, there's documentation from 4 counties. We're the human part of it, the part that makes it real. She paused. He was counting on all of us being too ashamed to speak. That's the only way his system works. If we stay silent, I am not staying silent. Anna looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, Neither am I. The trial was set for late March, nearly 6 weeks away. The interval was not idle. The territorial marshal's office assigned a deputy to coordinate the evidence from the 4 counties, and Evelyn spent several mornings at Pruitt's office going through documents, her letters, the Leavenworth postal records that the marshal had obtained through legal process, the Dennison affidavit, the arrest record from Cheyenne, the letters found on him at the time of his arrest. She read some of them twice, looking for gaps, for things that could be twisted in cross-examination, for anything she needed to be prepared to answer. It was painstaking work, and she found, to her own surprise, that she was good at it. She had a precise memory and a clear way of organizing information, and Pruitt at one point looked up from his own notes and said, half to himself, You'd have made a good attorney. I'd have made a disastrous attorney, she said. I have no patience for people talking in circles. That would be a professional limitation, yes. She spent time with the deputy marshal, too, a dry, methodical man named Gearhart, who had the habit of repeating back what you'd just said in slightly different words to check he'd understood it correctly, which she found both tedious and reassuring. He was thorough. He did not appear to disbelieve her, which she'd been braced for. At home, things continued. The ranch had its own rhythms that didn't pause for human drama, and she was grateful for this. The cattle needed tending, the barn needed work, the kitchen needed feeding. Noah needed help with a composition his teacher had assigned about westward settlement that he was approaching with visible skepticism about the romance of the subject. It wasn't actually very glorious, was it? He said one evening, bent over his paper at the kitchen table. Parts of it were, Evelyn said. Parts of it were very hard and very boring and sometimes quite bad. So how do I write about it? Write about the parts that seem true to you. He thought about this. Mrs. Fenton said to be positive. Mrs. Fenton teaches 9-year-olds, Wade said from behind his newspaper. She's being practical. Noah considered this, in the way he considered most things. Seriously, from several angles. Then he wrote something down, and Evelyn resisted the urge to look over his shoulder, which she thought showed considerable character on her part. 2 weeks before the trial, a 5th woman arrived. Her name was Helen Marsh, and she was from a town in Nebraska that Evelyn had never heard of, and she had traveled 3 days by train to be there. She was older than the others, perhaps 50, with a calm, dignified manner, and the quality of someone who has decided that humiliation is something that can be felt and then set aside. She had lost $120 to a man calling himself Daniel Trace, which was a name Evelyn had not heard before, but which Gearhart recognized from the documents with a look of grim confirmation. Helen had heard about the trial through a connection she did not fully explain, someone who knew someone. The informal network of women's talk that ran through communities like water under dry ground, invisible on the surface but moving constantly. She had come because she wanted to testify. Evelyn met her at this boarding house, and they sat together for a long time, not talking about the case at first, but about other things. Nebraska, Helen's daughter who was 17 and did not know the full story of what had happened. The particular difficulty of losing money you had saved over years because you'd done the accounting on a hopeful future rather than the present reality. I blame myself for a long time, Helen said, for being foolish enough to believe him. Most people would have believed him, Evelyn said. That was the point. I know that now. I didn't know it when I was sitting in my house trying to figure out how to explain to my daughter why we couldn't afford her school fees anymore. Helen looked at her cup. I'm not here because I think I'll feel better afterward, necessarily. I'm here because if he does this again, if they let him out in 2 years or 5 years or whenever, I want it to be on record that there were consequences, that it was not free. Evelyn thought about this for a long time after she left the boarding house that evening. She thought about all of it, the 5 of them, what they'd each carried alone and were now carrying together in this town that had never been home to most of them. She thought about shame as a mechanism, the way it worked to keep people separate, to keep each of them believing she was the only one and therefore uniquely foolish. How the isolation was the point was part of the design. She thought about the fact that she was going to stand in a courtroom in 2 weeks and say what had happened to her in front of a judge and a jury and a defense attorney whose job it was to make her seem unreliable, and she was going to be steady and clear, and she was not going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. The night before the trial began, she sat at the kitchen table with Wade long after Noah was in bed. He had a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, and she had a glass of water she was turning in her hands, and neither of them was talking about what was tomorrow exactly, which was the right instinct. There was nothing useful left to say about it. Are you ready? He asked finally. Not in the way that means I'm not afraid, she said. But yes. He looked at her. You have been... I want to say something, and I want to say it right, so give me a moment. She waited. When you came here, he said, you were in a bad situation, and I was in a bad situation, and I thought I was doing the practical thing by hiring someone competent. And that was true. He stopped. But what you've done, the way you handled all of this, the reason you have 5 women in this town willing to stand up in a courtroom tomorrow is because you didn't run, because you made it possible for them to see that not running was an option. He paused. Noah knows that. He doesn't have the words for it yet, but he knows it. She looked at the table. Her throat was doing something she wasn't going to allow to continue. You should have been a speaker, she said. That was a good speech. That was the most I've talked in one sitting since about 1887, he said. Don't get used to it. She laughed, actually laughed, and after a moment he did too, quiet and a little rusty, but real. They went to bed at a reasonable hour, and she lay in the dark and breathed slowly and let herself think about the morning in pieces rather than all at once. The trial began on the last Monday in March. The territorial courthouse in the county seat was a building of modest ambitions. 2 stories, pale wood, a small gallery that filled quickly with people who had found reasons to be in town that day. Evelyn sat with Pruitt and Gearhart at the prosecution's table, in a gray dress she'd pressed carefully the night before, her hands folded in her lap. Wade was in the gallery with Clara and Anna and Helen and a woman named Judith Crane who had arrived the previous week from a town 2 counties east. 6 women now, all with their own version of the same story, all in the same room. She did not look at the defendant's table often. When she did, she made herself look long enough to see him clearly and remember that he was a man, not a myth, not invincible, not the looming threat she'd been managing in her head since October. He was a man in a good suit sitting behind a lawyer who cost money, and he was looking at the room with the same pleasant, patient expression he'd worn in the dry goods shop, and she thought, I know what's under that. I've seen it. And so have the people in this gallery. The prosecution opened with the documentary evidence. Gearhart walked the court through the postal records, the letters, the chronology of contacts across 4 counties, the false affidavit, The letters found on the defendant at the time of his arrest with the 4 new women's names in them. It was methodical. It was dense. She watched the jury, 8 men, which was what the territory offered, and she watched them follow the paper trail with the concentration of people solving a puzzle, which was exactly how Gearhart had intended it. Then she was called to testify. She had told her story enough times by now that she could do it without the flinching. She told it to the court the way she'd told it to Pruitt, to Mrs. Pruitt's parlor, to Gearhart in his systematic, patient way, factually, precisely, without the kind of performance that lawyers for the defense could call emotional and therefore unreliable. She said what she'd received in letters and when. She said what she'd sent in money and why. She described the platform. She described the shop. She said the names, Coulter, Haig, Sinclair, clearly and without drama, because they didn't need drama. They were already damning. The defense attorney was a man named Pickett from the Capitol, expensive and competent, with the controlled aggression of someone who knows his client is guilty and has decided that his job is to make the witnesses seem like the problem. He came at her on cross-examination with the questions she'd expected. Why had she answered a matrimonial advertisement? Didn't that suggest desperation? Hadn't she sent money before meeting the man, which suggested reckless judgment? Was it possible she was misremembering? Was it possible she'd misidentified the defendant? She answered every question evenly. She did not take the bait on desperate. She did not bristle at reckless. She did not let him make her sound small. When he asked if it was possible she'd misidentified, she said, "I identified him by the handwriting I'd seen in 37 letters over 4 months, by the voice of those letters which is distinct, by the names he used which the marshal's office has independently documented, and by his own behavior when I named those names in front of witnesses. No, it is not possible I misidentified him." Pickett moved on. Clara testified next, and then Anna, and each of them told their version of the same story in their own voice. Clara with a dry precision that left no room for reinterpretation, Anna more quietly but with a specificity of detail that was its own kind of devastating. Helen followed, and she was the best of any of them, sitting in the witness chair with the dignity of a woman who has decided she is owed her anger and is expressing it in the most controlled possible way. The defendant himself took the stand at Pickett's direction and denied everything with the same pleasant, patient expression he wore for all occasions, and the jury watched him. And Evelyn watched the jury watching him, and she thought, "They hear it." Even without knowing what she knew, they hear it. The performance of it. The slight disconnect between the warmth of the face and the flatness underneath. She was not certain until the verdict. She refused to be certain, because certainty before the outcome was a kind of arrogance, and she had learned by now that the world did not reliably reward confidence. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. She sat with Wade in the courthouse corridor on a hard wooden bench and did not talk. He had his arm along the back of the bench, not touching her, just there. Clara and Helen and Anna sat nearby. Someone had procured coffee from somewhere, and it was terrible, which somehow helped. The terrible coffee was real, was present, was the kind of detail that kept you in your body when your mind wanted to go somewhere else. When they were called back in, she stood very straight. The verdict came back on all primary counts. Guilty. 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 Guilty on the fraud charges, guilty on the forgery charge, guilty on the charge of filing a false affidavit, guilty on the charge of obtaining money under false pretenses across multiple jurisdictions. She heard the words and felt something leave her. Not the tension she'd expected to release, but something older and heavier, something that had been sitting in her chest since October, since the platform, since the first moment she'd understood what had been done to her. It didn't evaporate. It moved, in the way that grief and anger and long-carried weight eventually move, from the place where it has been living in your body to somewhere else, somewhere that doesn't occupy the same space as breathing. She was not triumphant. She was tired. She was something that might, in a few weeks, resolve into something like settled. The sentencing was 12 years of hard labor in the territorial penitentiary. The judge noted for the record the number of victims and the deliberate, premeditated nature of the fraud. Not opportunistic, he said, but systematic, sustained, and predatory. And Evelyn kept her hands in her lap and listened and did not cry, which she had decided she would not do in this room. And then she stood up when the court was dismissed and shook Gearhart's hand and thanked Pruitt, and turned and found Wade directly behind her. He didn't say anything. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly, and she pressed her own hand over it. And then Clara was there, and Anna and Helen, and they were all in the middle of it together, not celebrating exactly, but present with each other in a way that meant something. Outside, the March air was cold, but had lost winter's edge. There was pale sunlight on the courthouse steps. Helen Marsh said, standing in that pale sunlight, "Well, it's done." "It's done," Evelyn agreed. Annadelle was looking at the street. "I keep thinking about the 4 women," she said. "The ones he had letters started for when they arrested him." "They're safe," Clara said, "because of what we did." Anna nodded slowly. I know that," she exhaled. "I just keep thinking about them." Evelyn understood. She thought about them too. 4 women whose names she didn't know, who had very nearly written back to a man who didn't exist, who would never know what had been done for them in a courthouse, in a town they'd probably never visit. That anonymity was not satisfying. It was simply how it was. She looked at the street. The ordinary street of an ordinary county seat on an ordinary March afternoon. People going about their business, a wagon unloading at the hardware store, 2 children running across the road, someone's dog standing in a doorway with the hopeful patience that dogs have. Wade was beside her. "Ready to go home?" he said. She thought about the word. The ranch 4 miles east, the house with its mended fence and its south-facing window, and its kitchen that smelled like coffee, and the boy asleep upstairs who had started leaving her small tokens. Arrowheads from the creek bed left on the kitchen windowsill without comment, which was his version of love at 9 years old. "Yes," she said. And they went. The drive home from the courthouse took the better part of an hour, and Evelyn spent most of it watching the land instead of talking. This was not unusual for her, and Wade knew it, so he let the silence run without filling it. The wagon moved along the road that she now knew well enough to read by instinct, where it dipped at the first creek crossing, where it curved around the outcropping of pale rock that caught the afternoon light a certain way in winter, where the cottonwoods along the eastern fence line began, thin and bare still in late March, but already showing the faint blush of green that meant they'd decided to live another season. She knew this road. That was not a small thing, and she held it while the wagon moved and the pale sunlight shifted and Wade drove with the quiet competence he applied to most things. She was thinking about what Helen Marsh had said on the courthouse steps. "It's done." 2 words, and both of them true, and neither of them quite adequate to the weight of what they contained. It was done. The man who had built a system out of loneliness and hope, and the particular vulnerability of women with no one to check his claims, he was done. 12 years. The judge's words stayed with her, systematic, sustained, and predatory. Not impulsive, not even purely about money. There was something in the design of it that was worse than greed. The letters, the careful warmth, the invented children, that was a man who understood exactly what he was taking and took it anyway, with precision, over and over again. She did not spend long on this. She had spent enough time on him already, more than he deserved, and she was not inclined to give him any more. What she was thinking about, under the surface of everything else, was the 4 women, the ones whose names she would never know. Annadelle had said it, and she'd agreed, and then she'd put it in the place where she kept things that were true but couldn't be resolved. Somewhere in the territory, in Kansas or Nebraska or Missouri or wherever the next postbox would have been, 4 women had received letters and were perhaps even now composing replies, full of the particular careful hope of people who have been alone long enough to be afraid to say so. They would not send those letters now. The man they were writing to would not receive them. That was not a thing she could feel satisfied about exactly, but it was a thing she could feel the weight of. The absence of a harm that should never have been possible in the first place. She thought this was probably as close to resolved as it was going to get. When the ranch came into view, she saw Noah in the yard before the wagon had even made the last turn. He must have been watching for them, had probably been watching for a while, because he came running before Wade had fully stopped the horse, and he went to Wade first, which was right, because Wade was his father, and then he came to her. "Well?" he said. "They found him guilty," she said, "on all charges." He looked at her face. He was 10 years old in 3 weeks. She'd been planning the cake for days. And he was old enough now to read situations rather than just react to them, to hold multiple things in his mind at once and sort them. He looked at her face and he said, "Are you all right?" She found unexpectedly that the question hit her square in the chest. "Yes," she said. "I think I actually am." He nodded, in the way that 10-year-olds nod when they're deciding whether to believe an adult or not, and then apparently decided to believe her because he said, "I kept the stove going, and I fed the chickens, and the dog got into the kitchen somehow, but I got him back out." "You did well," she said. "The beans are probably fine," he said, with careful optimism. Wade climbed down from the wagon. "How fine is probably fine?" "I watched the heat," Noah said, in a nearly perfect imitation of his father's tone. Evelyn laughed, and it was the real kind, the kind that came from somewhere low and genuine, and she put her arm around Noah's shoulders as they walked toward the house, and he let her, which he did more often now without needing to pretend it was incidental. The beans were, in fact, probably fine. Spring came the way springs come in that part of the territory. Not gently, not with any particular consideration for the people who had been waiting for it, but decisively, the way weather makes most of its decisions. The creek beds filled. The kitchen garden, which Evelyn had worked through February whenever the ground permitted, began to show the tentative green of things that had been planned for and were now keeping their end of the arrangement. The cattle moved differently in warmer weather, spread out across the pastures in ways that meant more riding for Wade and his one hired hand, a taciturn young man named Emery, who had shown up looking for work in January and had proven himself competent enough to stay. Life arranged itself around new rhythms. This was something she had not expected. Not the rhythms themselves, but the way she'd come to inhabit them. She had been in Blackridge since October. She had arrived as a woman with nothing, and she had built, in the way that people build things without fully noticing they're doing it, a life. It was not the life she'd imagined when she was 23 and had a different idea of what things were supposed to look like. It was not smooth or finished or free from the ordinary grinding difficulty of ranching on the frontier, where something was always breaking or dying or costing more than it should. The roof over the west bedroom needed attention before the next hard rain. The agreement with the beef buyer in the county seat was less favorable than it ought to have been, and Wade was in the process of renegotiating it with the stubborn patience he applied to anything that couldn't be resolved in a single conversation. Noah had recently developed a passionate and slightly alarming interest in the structural properties of things, which had resulted in a precarious but apparently intentional tower of stacked rocks in the corner of the barn that nobody was allowed to touch. None of this was the life she'd drawn for herself. It was, in most of the ways that mattered, better. She thought about this on a morning in April when she was in the kitchen garden on her knees in the dirt, working a row of soil that needed breaking up before she could plant the season's beans. The sky above was the solid pale blue of good weather, and behind her she could hear the occasional sound of Wade and Emery working in the near pasture, and from inside the house came the irregular thumping sound that meant Noah was doing something on the second floor that probably warranted investigation, but probably also didn't require immediate intervention. She pressed her hands into the dirt and worked the clots apart, and thought about the fact that she was here. Not abstractly here, philosophically here, gratefully here, but here in the specific physical sense of a person whose hands were in the dirt of a place that had become hers. There was something in that which she did not have adequate words for, and she'd stopped trying to find them. Some things were better held than named. Clara Hesse had gone back to her town 3 weeks after the trial. They had exchanged addresses and a promise to write, which they'd kept. Letters arrived irregularly and said practical things, and occasionally said true things, which was the best kind of correspondence. Annadelle had gone back to Holt County and written once to say she was managing, which Evelyn understood to mean that managing was the most she could honestly claim yet, and she wrote back with the kind of letter that didn't push for more than that. Helen Marsh had returned to Nebraska and her 17-year-old daughter, and her last letter had said her daughter now knew the full story and had taken it hard, and they were working through it together, which sounded difficult and right. Judith Crane had done something unexpected. She had not gone home. She had stayed in Blackridge, had taken a room at Mrs. Calloway's boarding house on a permanent basis, and had begun working as an assistant at Mrs. Fenton's school, where her competence had apparently made itself evident within about 2 weeks. She and Evelyn had coffee together on Thursday mornings, which had become a habit neither of them had formally proposed. On one of these Thursdays in early May, Judith set down her cup and said, out of no particular context, Do you ever regret staying? Evelyn considered the question as she'd learned to consider Judith's questions, directly, without deflecting, because deflection with Judith never worked and was also disrespectful. No, she said. Though I think if you'd asked me in December, I might have given you a different answer. There were days when staying felt like stubbornness rather than courage. What's the difference? Stubbornness is staying because you won't give ground. Courage is staying because giving ground would cost you something that matters more than the fight. She paused. I wasn't always sure which one I was doing. Judith looked at her cup. I think you were usually doing the second one. You're more generous than I am. I know you better than you know yourself, Judith said, which was not entirely accurate but was kindly meant, and Evelyn let it stand. She thought about that conversation for days afterward. The question of courage versus stubbornness was one she'd been living inside for months without putting language to it, and having the language didn't resolve it so much as give it a shape she could examine. She had been stubborn. She had also been, at various moments, genuinely afraid and genuinely uncertain and genuinely unsure whether the staying was wisdom or merely the absence of anywhere good to go. She thought the honest answer was both. She had stayed for complicated reasons, some of them brave and some of them simply human, and the outcome had been what it was not because she was exceptional, but because she had not, at the crucial moments, let the fear make her decisions for her. This seemed like the important distinction. The garden came in well that spring, better than she'd expected, given the state of the soil and the late start. By June, the kitchen had fresh produce again, and the pantry smelled right, the way a pantry is supposed to smell when a household is running on its own terms rather than managing. She put up preserves and taught Noah to help with the canning, which he found scientifically interesting and was willing to assist with on those grounds, making detailed observations about the sealing process that she didn't have the heart to find tedious. Wade watched all of this from the edges. That was his way, not absent, not distant in the emotional sense, but a step back, observing, the way a man observes something he values and isn't quite sure he deserves. She had noticed this about him from the beginning and understood it more now. He had built a life once and lost it, and the loss had made him careful with new things, holding them slightly away from himself, waiting to see if they'd hold. She understood this because she'd done the same thing. They had a marriage that was honest rather than easy. They disagreed occasionally, with the friction of two people who both have strong opinions about the correct way to approach a problem, and these disagreements did not always resolve quickly or cleanly. He had a tendency to go silent when he was processing something difficult, which she'd learned to wait out rather than push, though the waiting was not always comfortable. She had a tendency to keep working when she was upset, which he'd identified early on as her version of the same thing and had the sense not to interrupt. They were learning each other. This seemed to her like the actual substance of what people called a marriage. Not the ceremony, not the sentiment, but the ongoing work of understanding another person well enough to be fair to them even when you were tired or wrong or afraid. It was slower than the stories made it sound. It was also more. One evening in late June, after Noah was in bed, she found Wade on the porch. He did this occasionally, sat on the front porch after dark with nothing in particular to do, which was unusual enough for him that she'd come to understand it meant he was thinking about something he hadn't decided how to say yet. She sat beside him. The night was warm and smelled of dry grass and something faintly sweet from the kitchen garden. The sky out here, away from town, was enormous. The stars, not the scattered handful you got in the city, but the full, staggering quantity of them, so many it looked crowded. Noah asked me something today, Wade said. She waited. He asked if you were his mother now. He said it looking at the yard, not at her. He wasn't asking if you'd replaced her. I want to be clear about that. He was asking something else, something more like, if you were staying. If this was permanent. She thought about this boy who had tucked a photograph inside his arithmetic book and talked about rosewater and kept his grief in a tin box in the barn, who had, over 8 months, left 17 arrowheads on the kitchen windowsill and never once mentioned them directly. What did you tell him? She said. I told him that was a question he should ask you. She looked at the stars for a while. I'll talk to him tomorrow, she said. If that's all right. It's all right. Another silence. The comfortable kind. I've been thinking, she said, about the spring calves. The numbers are better than they were last year, but the agreement with the county buyer is still shorting us on price. You've been negotiating it, I know, but I want to look at the contracts myself. I think there may be a clause that's working against us that you might not have. Evelyn, he said. What? We don't have to talk about the contracts tonight. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the faint expression, not quite a smile, something quieter, that she had come to recognize as his version of contentment, which he wore only in specific circumstances and never for very long before he noticed it and put it away. What do you want to talk about? She said. Nothing in particular, he said. I'm fine, just sitting here. She considered this. All right, she said. They sat on the porch in the warm June dark, and the stars did what they always did, which was exist without any opinion about the people beneath them. And the horses moved in the near pasture. And from inside the house, there was no sound at all because Noah was asleep, and the house was simply the house. Walls and windows and fireplace, and the accumulated small evidence of people living in it. Of someone's boots by the back door and a half-finished composition on the kitchen table and 17 arrowheads on a windowsill. She sat with all of it and did not try to make it into a lesson. In the morning, she found Noah at breakfast, already dressed and already on his second piece of bread, which meant he'd been awake for a while. She poured coffee and sat across from him, and he looked up with the watchful, oblique attention that had softened some over the months, but never entirely gone away. Your father said you had a question for me, she said. He put the bread down. His hands fidgeted slightly with the edge of his plate. I didn't exactly ask him a question. I was saying something, and it turned into a question. What were you saying? He looked at the table. I was saying that it feels different now, the house, like it's... I don't know how to say it. Try. He pressed his lips together, thinking. Like it has someone in it again, he said finally. Not that Pa wasn't... Pa was here. But there's a difference between someone being in a house and someone being in a house. He frowned at himself. That doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense, she said. He looked up at her. I'm not going anywhere, she said. That's what you were trying to ask, I think, whether this was permanent. He was very still. It is, she said. She stopped herself from saying stuck with me, which would have been flippant, and found the truer version. You're mine now, if that's agreeable to you. He looked at the table for a long moment. She did not fill the silence. Okay, he said. His voice was steady. The tips of his ears were red. Good, she said. Now eat your breakfast. He ate his breakfast. He left for school 20 minutes later, and she watched him from the kitchen window. The small, careful figure crossing the yard toward the road with his book bag and his determined stride. And she thought about all the different versions of this moment she might have had. All the different directions her life might have gone if she'd made different choices, or if different things had been done to her, or if she'd been weaker, or if he'd been less careful, or if Wade had not happened to be at the feed and grain on that particular October morning. She thought, there is no tidy version of this story. There is no version where the man doesn't take her money and her hope and 6 months of her life. There is no version where she doesn't stand on that platform in the dust and the coal smoke and understand what has been done to her. There is no version that begins anywhere other than with a deliberate, calculated harm done to a woman who was lonely enough to be vulnerable and decent enough to deserve better. What there is instead is what came after. And what came after was not a correction of the harm. Harms don't correct, they just stop. But something that happened in spite of it, and because of it and alongside it, shaped by the fact that she had not let the harm define the limits of what was possible. She turned away from the window. She was not going to make a lesson of it. That had never been her instinct. To extract meaning from suffering and hold it up for examination. To say, look, this is what the pain was for. She distrusted that instinct in herself and in others. The pain was not for anything. It simply was. And she had moved through it. And what she'd found on the other side was not wisdom or transformation or any of the things that stories promise. What she'd found was this: a kitchen in a house that was hers, a man on a porch in the dark who was content to sit without talking, a boy with 17 arrowheads on a windowsill, a garden that was coming in better than expected, work that needed doing and the capacity to do it. This was not everything. Some mornings she woke with the weight of October still in her chest, the particular residue of being made to feel like nothing. And she lay still for a while and let it be there and then got up and started the coffee. Some days the ranch felt very far from anywhere, and the work very relentless, and the future an uncertain shape she couldn't quite see. Some evenings she and Wade sat in the same room and were simply two people in the same room. And there was nothing transcendent about it, and she was tired and so was he, and they went to bed and slept and got up and did it again. This was the actual texture of the life she had, not the version in the letters she'd received, that careful false warmth, not promised perfection, but the real thing, which was ordinary and difficult and sometimes surprising and more hers than anything she'd had before. She had lost $22 in 6 months, and a version of hope that, looking back on it now, had been fragile because it was built on someone else's invented promises rather than anything she'd made herself. What she had now she'd made herself. Some of it with Wade, some of it with Noah, some of it with the women who'd stood in a courthouse and said what was true out loud in front of people paid to disbelieve them, some of it alone, in the ordinary daily work of maintaining a life that no one was going to maintain for her. She poured the rest of the coffee and took it out to the porch because it was a fine morning and the garden needed looking at, and she stood in the early light with the cup warm in her hands and the air still carrying the edge of night's coolness, and she looked at what she'd planted and watched it grow. Judith came for coffee on Thursday as usual, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked about the school and the summer and whether the new roof over the west bedroom was going to be as expensive as Wade had estimated. And eventually Judith said, in the way she had of landing on something without preamble, "You look different." "Different how?" "Settled." Judith considered the word. Not comfortable. Settled. Evelyn thought about the difference. "I know what I'm doing here," she said. "That's probably it. I know what the work is, and I know who I'm doing it with, and I know what it's for." "Is that enough?" "It's more than most people have," she said. "So yes, I think it's enough." Judith nodded, satisfied, and reached for more coffee. That summer the garden produced more than they could eat before the heat peaked, and she spent the better part of a week putting things up, and Noah helped with the canning and complained about the steam and asked 17 questions about the metallurgical properties of tin lids, and Wade came in one afternoon to find them both red-faced and slightly ridiculous looking over a pot of boiling water, and did not say anything, only got himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter and watched them with the expression she recognized and loved, the one he only wore when he thought no one was paying attention. She was always paying attention. The arrowheads on the windowsill had reached 23 by August. She counted them one morning without intending to, just standing at the window while the coffee brewed, and found herself looking at 23 pieces of chipped stone that a 10-year-old boy had placed there one at a time over nearly a year, without ever saying why, without ever asking her to notice. She noticed. She left them exactly where they were. What she understood, standing there in the morning light of a house that had become hers in the only way that mattered, not by gift or by letter or by any promised future, but by the slow, imperfect, honest work of living in it, was this. The woman who had stepped off the train in October had not been wrong to hope. She had only been hoping in the wrong direction, toward something that had been built to look like what she needed while giving her nothing real. What was real was here, had been here all along, in the way that real things usually are, undramatic, unannounced, requiring you to show up for them rather than waiting for them to arrive. She had shown up. That was what she would say, if anyone ever asked her what she'd done. Not that she'd been brave, because bravery was too large a word and too clean. Not that she'd been strong, because strength implied she hadn't been afraid. And she had been afraid, consistently and sometimes badly. Only that she had shown up. She had gotten off the platform. She had taken the job. She had given her statement. She had stood in a courtroom and said what was true. She had stayed. It was not a heroic story. It was a human one. A woman who made a mistake, and then another, and then found her footing and held it. A man who had been drowning and was slowly, ungracefully learning how to be above water again. A child who kept his grief in a tin box and left arrowheads on windowsills because he didn't have the vocabulary yet for what he was trying to say. None of them were finished. That was the other thing. The story did not end with the verdict, or the marriage, or the summer the garden came in well. People did not end. They continued, and the continuing was sometimes wonderful and sometimes very hard and usually somewhere in between. And the work of it was the thing itself, not the arrival at some better place, but the ongoing, effortful, imperfect act of building one. Evelyn Bennett stood at her kitchen window in the August morning, watching her garden, drinking her coffee. In an hour, she would have work to do. In an hour, Noah would come clattering down the stairs with his school things, and Wade would come in from the early feeding with hay in his hair and cold hands, and the day would begin in all its ordinary, unremarkable specificity. She was ready for it. She turned from the window and set down her cup and began.